Good evening. Welcome to Bloomberg. My name is Callum Burns, and it's great to have you all here this evening. We have a very interesting discussion, I believe, ahead of us today on the alternative tech futures and disruptors. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we're all meeting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd like to thank the Australian Strategic Policy Institute for having the dialogue today here at Bloomberg and our partners at AWS. We're delighted to have you here, and I'm extremely excited about this conversation. We have some amazing speakers in store for the event, and the topic of evolving technology is certainly one that Bloomberg has been watching closely for many years. We began the business 40 years ago disrupting the financial markets through automation and transparency. But we also are watching this space today as a threat and opportunity for our business in the future, and also the impacts for our clients and the communities which we're responsible for. Things seem to be changing incredibly fast in this space, and it was only last week that Bloomberg launched our own element, Bloomberg GPT, which I'm sure you'll hear much more on the topic of later on. Feels pretty hard to stay up to date with everything that's going on in this space, but I think there's no one better than the incredible speakers that we've got here today lined up this evening to try and do that. So with that, I'm going to hand across to our first speaker, Anders Sorman Nielsen, futurist and founder of think tank Think, and hope you all have a wonderful evening today. Thank you.
G'day. How you going?
Fantastic. Just making sure this slightly weird Swedish Australian accent is making some kind of sense and connecting some of the more analog and some of the more digital radio antenna out there in the ether tonight. How did you all enjoy your AI operated rises to the 27th level, by the way? Did you all know that the lifts are operated by AI? Okay, who's going to feel a little bit nervous after a few more cocktails this evening going down? All right. Of course, is all around us, ladies and gentlemen. Now, as a futurist, this gets me excited. By the way, as a futurist, I should just say that my mum has absolutely no idea what I do for a living. Is that just me? Anyone else struggle a little bit to explain? Okay, all right. She calls me her son, the one who used to be a lawyer, who's now a glorified astrologer. So thank you, Mum. But as a futurist, I like to claim that I'm a little bit of a traditionalist and maybe, dare I even say, even a little bit of a humanist at heart. And tonight's session, I want to explore some other paradoxes, some other dilemmas that we're currently facing when it comes to creating and designing alternative technology futures, both digital dystopia, but also hopefully an emergence of a second renaissance, a flourishing of human creativity, courtesy of technologies as well. And I'll let you guys be the judge of what we're currently designing as humanity. Now, it's been said that the future is already here. It's just been unevenly distributed. And I do want to just dig into a couple of areas where I see future case studies already being at play around the world and both the threats and opportunities in them. Back in 2013, Leon Panetta, the then Secretary of Defense, suggested a new type of medal for valor in cyber combat, essentially for drone operators and cyber defenders. What do you think the human reactions from real men and women on the front lines, the analog physical front lines, I come from a military family, by the way, were to this new cyber medal? Outrage, and this proposal got killed within record time. Growing up in a military family in Sweden, my dad's a colonel in the Swedish army, which is a great career move because we never go to war. Although he has done his bit with the UN and NATO and Afghanistan and former Yugoslavia, etc. as well. So cap nod of approval to Dad there. But he had a sense that this new world of battle lines was totally foreign to him. But of course, we all have to recognize in the last 10 years that with digital emergence, new technologies, AI, weaponized systems, artificial systems, that the battle lines of warfare have moved from the analog linear world into the digital and into the exponential world. Now, apologies, before I raise these couple of case studies here, I would like to preemptively apologize to anyone if you have family, friends, loved ones who have been impacted by these two particular events or associated events. I do apologize for raising them here in the room. I think the second one is a really heartening example of how we can code for more humane outcomes and reduce the inhumane consequences of human error. The truck on your left, ladies and gentlemen, is a dump truck. This particular make and model on Bastille Day in 2016 was hijacked by a terrorist from ISIS who drove it for 1.6 kilometers in the physical world down the highway, in the process taking out 92 human lives, 482 people injured in that event, many more families suffering from PTSD and the loss of loved ones. Let's contrast that with the smart truck on your right, built after an EU directive in 2013, which said that any truck on the roads of the EU built after 2013 had to be part of the Internet of Things, had to be equipped with an advanced braking system and sensors. Now, maybe luckily or maybe very foolishly by the terrorists in the Berlin Christmas market attack of the same year, he decided to hijack the truck on your right. Now, with his foot still on the accelerator, not after 1.6 kilometers, but rather after 50 meters, the truck shut down the terrorist. The loss of human lives, the impact of that event, less than 10% of what we'd seen in Nice only a few months before. Ladies and gentlemen, we can code for more humane outcomes when we use technology to the upside. Now, if you're a real cynic out there tonight, you'll say in the future, the cyber caliphate will just send in the code. We know today, sadly, that yes, operational warfare starts with sending in the code and then maybe the tanks later on between state and maybe even non-state actors. Now, as humans, as my dad, we struggle in a very linear fashion to make sense of new technologies. And according to Amara's law, we tend to overhype and overestimate the impact of emergent new technologies in the short term. Currently, AI, virtual reality, autonomous vehicles, for example, but we underestimate their impact over the long term. GPS, navigation, telemedicine, internet, and e-commerce. Now, during the pandemic, the technology really became our lifeline. And the most human touch in any customer or human journey now, of course, became the digital touch. Now, a quick word from our sponsors here to all of you. The digital means of production are changing by the second, and of course, through synthetic media, we all have the ability to create God knows what types of content. In fact, our friends, our clients at Microsoft have recently told me that it only takes 3 seconds of a WhatsApp conversation or any kind of digital conversation you've had to create a podcast worth of content in your voice through synthetic media. Imagine what can happen with new announcements on Bloomberg or otherwise with a CEO doing that kind of announcement. All right, so here's a little word from our sponsor.
You blame me for interfering with your democracy, but I don't have to. You are doing it to yourselves. Polling stations are closing. You don't know who to trust. You are divided. There are strings we can pull, but we don't have to. You are pulling them for us.
Now, we have built an ad-funded business model known as the internet, a glorified version of of selling and buying stuff. We're all addicted now, according to the social dilemma, to the scroll, refresh, doom scrolling, etc., capturing our attention. And we're currently distracted from real analog reality by digital distraction. Aren't you happy they began this session with a motivational futurist, ladies and gentlemen? And this might sound like quite a doomy and gloomy sort of scenario. We'll just move forward to the next one here. But the question is, beyond the ad-funded model that we have built, which is any demagogue's way of potentially controlling, dividing and conquering attentions, or even spreading synthetic media, leading to things like genocide and worse outcomes around the planet. This has also got real human repercussions in terms of the types of work we might do in the future. So before we talk about a couple of other future scenarios, I just want to take us back to an easier place for a moment in time and take you back to my native city of Stockholm, Sweden, back in the city that was just about to be hit by the pandemic of that era, the Spanish flu. So this urban vista here back in the 1910s, when things were just a little bit quieter, things were a little bit simpler, things were either this or that, either black or white or not as grayscale. Amazingly, people only wore black or white clothing in those days. No floral pattern pocket squares that had been invented quite yet. Now this here was the urban vista that once upon a time greeted a man by the name of Juan, or the son of Johan, which sounds very Viking-esque, or George Johansson as we'd call him here in Australia. As the second oldest son on the family farm, he had few inheritance rights, and as a result, he had to make his own commercial entrepreneurial future in the cityscape of Stockholm. And his commercial opportunity after completing a retail apprenticeship for nearly 6 years during the dawn of the First World War was to open up the bricks and mortar doors to his first little store, dressing the increasingly sophisticated Swedish gentleman of that era. Take his venture capital and breathe life into something new to create work for other human beings. And of course, this was before biometric authentication, before CCTV, before Instagram husbands, and even before identification through camera with 94% accuracy, according to the Chinese state, could identify you as you based on your gait. And looking into a camera was very much of a technological novelty. And his business model was all about the bespoke, the personal touch, the seasonally adjusted girth of the Swedish gentleman. And as he became a man of commerce, he decided in a cap note of approval to his family heritage and provenance to change his surname from Johansson to the man from the southern farm, or in Swedish, Sorman. He's my great-grandfather, and as you can tell, he must have been a bit of a futurist because he's got a great haircut, a cool little pocket square. And you can also see that we share some genealogical traits with North Korean dictators. He invested in the latest, very manipulative technology, the neon sign, to win the then analog hearts and then analog minds of yesteryear's customers. Looks pretty amazing for a 106-year-old, as you can tell. we moisturize in our family. She still dresses me every day of the week. This is a lot that shifted underneath her feet, like for so many other humans who are struggling with digital transformation, digital disruption, and what the future of work might hold for humans. He calls the new customer who will walk into the store and scan a few barcodes to contribute to the real-time data comparative pricing cloud, and then they'll say, hey, we'll think about it, and you know they're not going to think about it. Then they go around the corner with one of the items on MrPorter.com instead. She calls this new type of client a cyber terrorist, because it showcases that her very, very human business model is no longer sustainable for a digitally disrupted world where increasingly, yes, as humans, our minds have become digitized. And now on top of that layer, there might be a very, very digital mind, AI in the cloud that Steve Wozniak and Elon Musk have now written an open letter to have a moratorium to stop the development of AI. Now, a few years ago, I wrote a little love letter to my mum called Digilog, how to win the digital minds and the analog hearts of tomorrow's customers. Jordan, we'll just move on that one. Win the digital minds and the analog hearts of tomorrow's customers. And my mum, I should say, is my toughest pro bono client. Sadly, you never become a prophet in your hometown. So while CEOs and Fortune 500 leaders listen to this book and listen to the digital signal from the future, and even despite the fact that I say that, Mum, the future is not necessarily about throwing away the analog humane baby with the digital bathwater, but it's about embracing the best of these two worlds together. Sadly, she didn't listen. And when the pandemic happened, Mum was not digitally diversified enough to cope with that black swan event, or whatever you want to call it. After 104 years in history, sadly, my parents had to file for bankruptcy at the ages of 70 and 67. The human cost to all of this digitization is real. Now, it's my biggest shame, my biggest failure as a futurist, not to get my mum to listen to my advice. But beyond that, of course, out of the 16 staff that you had, only one has been gainfully re-employed in the same industry. And many of our customers are, of course, very happily shopping on the iconic, etc. No judgment. Okay? We've created an ad-funded business model where we're all addicted to clicking on clickbait, ladies and gentlemen. We love doom scrolling and being addicted to our social media networks. But the question is, when are we going to start creating content that's actually useful? Content today is chemistry wrapped in narrative. At what point will we start developing useful, maybe true content verified by a non-fungible token so that people can come to trust truth again? I'll say it again. Content is chemistry wrapped in story or narrative. We have a responsibility to create content that's useful digital nutrition for somebody so they can make smarter decisions, because we now have the powers, like Leonardo DiCaprio in Inception, who there was a corporate thief stealing corporate, who knows Bloomberg information out of dreams and the subconscious minds of his targets. Today, we have the ability maybe not to steal corporate secrets from someone's deep subconscious minds, but certainly to implant them with synthetic media and powerful media, be it Macron on the streets recently of Paris or the synthetic arrest of Donald Trump. That is something that's being deeply implanted into our deep subconscious minds, ladies and gentlemen. Social media dysmorphia, for example, is another idea. Or as Leonardo DiCaprio says in the movie, what's the most resilient parasite in the world? It's an idea, carefully crafted in the subconscious mind. This is where we now live, ladies and gentlemen, at the dawn of something totally new. However, the upside, of course, is that technologies also enable us to do less of the menial and the mundane and more of the meaningful and the humane. Who here loves punching spreadsheets? And if you were to do a pie chart of your day of work, like what percentage would be really meaningful and humane work? Or do you do more robotic style work? What would you like it to be if you redesigned it with the use and help of robotics and artificial intelligence? We're even creating even better digital nutrition for yourself and your family, like this $3 billion app known as Headspace. Now, my 5.5-year-old son, Lucian, has trouble falling asleep. And even the GP has said that he's got some early stage anxieties. With a dad like me, you can understand why. All right. But we also love science fiction, as you can tell. And so we now do breath work every night with Yoda through the app. Why? Because this app, built firmly ensconced and focused on UN Sustainable Goal number 3, good health and well-being, including mental health, provides digital nutrition for him to be able to calm down and for us to start creating new stories, new trust with the digital world. Now, I've always struggled to do this little post-mortem on my mum's business. I do have permission to talk about it. She gets a little licensing fee every time. All right, different business model. But I always think as a futurist, why don't we engage in more pre-mortems? And I want you to just think about this question in the back of your minds. Just go out on a little space odyssey to 2030. Now think on your watch, your company, your organization, your department went belly up. On your watch. What were the trends from the future that you just missed? What were the future signals that you deliberately chose to ignore? And what were the investment decisions, either in yourselves or your organization, your country, that you just delayed and delayed that led to that demise? And instead, based upon what you'll hear in today's panel and in this discussion, what change will you make today to prevent that from happening? An alternative future scenario, ladies and gentlemen, is the idea that pandemics have traditionally, whether it's the Spanish flu leading to the Roaring '20s, for example, or the Black Plague, which in its tragic effects killed off 50% of Florence's population, also laid the fertile grounds for a renaissance. With 50% of people losing their lives, there was a premium on labor in Florence at the time. Schools were created by the Medici family, known as innovation intersections, where people from disparate fields came together to contribute their versions of the world from different ethnic, cultural, educational backgrounds, gender, etc. These innovation intersections led to the first Renaissance. And as a result of the labor-saving technologies from people like Leonardo da Vinci, we also saw that with that premium on labor, peasants became artisans, artisans became merchants, and merchants became new noble men and women, creating artworks and scientific thought, Machiavellian thought, humanist and scientific breakthroughs that we are still in awe at today. And I believe today we are at the dawn of such a second Renaissance, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to start preparing for that future day to combine the best and the most humanist ethos that you are possible to do, to dig deep, to do responsible AI and contribute at the intersection of different ways of viewing the world, combining paradox as you can, and to combine the best of human intelligence together with artificial intelligence to hopefully spawn a new era of humanism and responsible use of technology. Thank you very much and see you in that future.
Good evening. That will be a little bit better. Anders, thank you so much. That was really a brilliant laydown of a lot of the a lot of what we're facing, and we're going to be talking about it this next panel. I'd like to invite up this terrific panel that that has been ASPI has assembled. Vikram Sharma, who's CEO and founder of Quintessential Labs. Heather Richmond, who's an entrepreneur in residence at BMNT and founder of the Defense Investor Network. Jonathan Rubinstein, CEO of Nuix. And if I can invite Simon Alicia as Chief Technologist for AWS. And thank you all for being here. First of all, wow, I mean, I'm sort of amazed by what we just heard. And I think we have a lot we can talk about in terms of our topic on disruption. Oh, I should say I'm Linda Laurie. So from my background, I recently left the White House, where I was assistant director for research and technology security, where I was concerned about what happens when these disruptive technologies fall into the wrong hands, and how do we prevent, and by we, I mean both the US government, the Australian government, allied governments and partners, how do we all prevent the technologies from falling into the wrong hands and being manipulated by the wrong hands or being controlled by the wrong hands. And so I wanted to thank ASPE for organizing this great panel, and to Bloomberg, incidentally, your founder, Michael Bloomberg, is currently the chairman of the Defense Innovation Board at the Pentagon, and he's really leading the charge in this area, which is exciting. And to AWS for having us. This panel, I think we wanted to talk about geostrategic competition, and as I've been here for a couple of days and talking to everyday Australians and talking to government and other thought leaders here, I'm struck by differences in how Australia and the US view our tech competition a little bit differently. But at the end of the day, we're really in an existential, if I can use an overused word, tech competition between democracies and autocracies, between freedoms and surveillance societies, and I think and tech disruption is really plays a major part of that. And the stakes of this competition can't be higher. We're talking about not just kinetic warfare, but really, in today's newspapers, talking about TikTok and how all of our 12-year-olds and 12 to 18-year-olds are not just dancing to fun videos and watching cat videos, but what content they're seeing is really being pushed to them and controlled by somebody who has different motivations than our societies have. We have this terrific panel with really different backgrounds and different interests, but I'm excited to hear from you all. And first, wanted to ask about how you each describe disruptor mindset and how different disruptor ideas can work together to leverage the best of our free and open societies, and position the US, Australia, and our allies and partners to gain and grow an advantage in this tech competition. So if I can start with Vikram for a little bit of your thoughts in this area.
Super. Thank you very much, Linda. And what a tough act to follow us there. But certainly, I think as we've heard, we've had the Sydney dialogue that's been unfolding during the day here in Sydney. And there's no question that certain types of critical technologies are very much being leveraged, in fact, being driven for geostrategic gain, whether that's for strategy, whether it's militarily, or even economically. And in fact, to look at one specific one close to my own heart, the area of quantum, is certainly an area where you see this playing out. You see it on the critical technology list of many countries, maybe even most countries. I think we look at the spending that's invested into this worldwide or committed to the quantum area. Some back of the envelope numbers that we did suggest that $35 to $40 billion are committed to quantum broadly across its various aspects. And interestingly enough, when you sort of look at the distribution of that, it could be argued that something of the order of 1/3, perhaps 40%, is commitments that are coming out of China towards this sector. So certainly in AI and quantum look to be two areas that have been very much targeted. exactly as we said, to be strategically important for the Chinese, but more broadly globally. And of course, it will have far-reaching ramifications. If you look at quantum, you have quantum computing, ability to solve problems at scales, at speeds that are just unimaginable for certain classes of problems today, rendering tractable types of problems which we just not solvable today, whether that's new drugs, it's inventing a better aircraft wing, or indeed cracking some of the codes that we use today to protect e-commerce. You have imaging, you have sensing, but interestingly enough, as we say at our company, you can use quantum to fight quantum. So quantum gives you the capabilities to fight some of the challenges that quantum computing will offer. So I think as nations, and indeed as corporates working within those nations, a recognition and indeed the right policy settings that can drive the advancement of these critical technologies forward and allow particularly like-minded countries to collaboratively develop the skill sets required to counter the potential threat. Absolutely critical.
Great, thanks. Heather, you're working a lot with investors, with the VC community and family offices. How do you see this disruptor mindset in the investment and capital community?
So I live in Menlo Park, California, which is smack in the middle of Silicon Valley. And I think that, but I come from government, right? So understanding kind of the structures of those, I think what we see is the concept of failure being part of the process. When you're trying to disrupt something, you're going to fail over and over and over again. I think as investors, and people can attest, they're putting money into something. They're putting money into a team of world-class talent, right? And I think we forget sometimes we focus on technologies, we focus on the process, but really, I think what we need to be doing is harnessing world-class teams. And there's been a big kind of drought as far as world-class teams being allowed to work with your government, our government, to work with government, because it's difficult. It takes a long time. It's not very transparent. And so I think part of on the disruption side, on the process side, on the government side, how do we make that process more transparent? How do we create ways for these two worlds to be communicating regularly, and make that easier? But on the private side, how do we accept failure? How do we teach government about failure? So I think for me, you always hear this term public-private partnership. I kind of hate that term because I think it doesn't mean anything to anyone sometimes. It's just this concept of a public. What does it mean? It means, are we communicating? Are we translating? Are we actually, putting processes in place that these two worlds can actually work together? So I think there's a process there. As far as disruptor, there's the disruption of the processes that are in place that need to be broken and rebuilt. And then there's also just on the straight technology and harnessing world-class talent. I think there's a disruption piece there.
And are investors more interested in investing in disruption or in something that's proven?
It's so in Silicon Valley, we, when you're going to invest in a company, you say, what's your unfair advantage? Like, that's the term you say. Like, what can you do that no one else is doing? What can you do better, faster? So if you can prove that, if you can show that, by all your market research that, hey, I've got something that is just better, faster, more, they want to invest in that. What I'm seeing though is there's been a bit of a tipping point around, I think we talked earlier about, commercial space has been really fascinating. It's wildly capital intensive. It's very risky. It takes so long that you can't really, nothing's proven. I mean, there are some companies that have proven quite a bit, but it's still very unproven. But the appetite for that from the commercial or from the private sector investors in the last 5, 6, 7 years has completely changed. And so we're seeing a huge tipping point. I think it's an interesting industry also, and I'll shut up, but also because you've got, space is inherently global and you can't launch anything without working with the government. So those relationships are they're not nice to haves, they're have to haves. And so with quantum, with space, with semiconductors, you're seeing these industries now that are requiring very patient private capital. We're seeing family offices and high net worth individuals being much more open. I think part of that has been the China threat, COVID hit, and then you've got Ukraine going. You've got people who are looking at, what are their children and grandchildren going to be facing in the next, many decades, and it's terrifying. And so we're seeing people put their money where their fears are. I hate to say it that way, but it's true. Which at the same time is really fascinating. And we have a really amazing entrepreneur in the room who's going to talk about that later. But this idea of world-class talent coming together, working on national security challenges.
So, Jonathan, talking about disruption, you're working in data. You're disrupting how we look at data and how we use data. I'd love to hear your thoughts on disruption in this sector. And also if you could throw a little about privacy and use of data, because at least in the United States, people are very concerned about data privacy, and I suspect here as well. Would love to hear a little bit about how you both disrupt and yet calm the waters.
So I run a business, and what we do is we ingest massive amounts of data and we make it searchable. Unstructured data, make it searchable. And when I think about disruption, I think there are a couple of ingredients. And I think it's interesting to think about, for example, the social element, which is, in the US, I think people are much more comfortable failing. In Australia, only failing isn't a cultural attribute that one's proud of. In the US, you fail, you move on and you learn.
Yeah, we love it.
But I think, where does innovation, what creates innovation and disruption? And I look at Israel as an example, which I think, I think pressure and existential pressure is a good starting point. And I think where, the tectonic plates of change and power is happening now. And I think that that pressure is happening. Today's conference, which is how do we disrupt? So I think that's a great ingredient. I think that a key purpose is also a great ingredient. Existential is always a good one. Survival and living is probably the best ingredient. And then I think that motivation. And I always think of Daniel Pink wrote a book, Motivation 2.0, which is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. But purpose, how do you drive that purpose that then drives that innovation? So in the disruption kind of context, I think that when you look at public and private partnership, I think that the disruption and my experience is figuring out how to link those two together and link the cultural aspects, the motivation and the purpose together is super interesting. In terms of data privacy, I think, again, we've heard a lot about cyber. It is simply something we have to live with. Our data is becoming more available, and we talk about the threat surface. The threat surface everywhere is getting more complex. I'm not. Our perspective is. Breaches are going to happen, making sure that so stopping the breaches is almost impossible. But making sure that when the breach has happened and what is identified, you protect it in that scenario is our perspective on data. And I think that the reality is that there's lots you can do in that scenario around making sure that not only do you protect your perimeter, but actually when the perimeter is breached, because it most likely will be breached, that you're protected in that scenario.
So Simon, AWS is one of the sponsors. You can talk about anything you want. But what kinds of, as a chief technologist, what kinds of things keep you up at night? What disruption are you looking for? AWS is such an interesting and novel platform. I guess one of the first cloud platforms. And so that's disruption in and of itself. But how do you take disruption to the next level?
Well, I think disruption is a really interesting concept in that we love to talk about it happening to others, but not to ourselves. And thinking about the mental models of how people will respond to the application of technologies and hopefully the intelligent application of technologies is actually the most important part. Because again, human beings are not a homogenous group. We have different personas, different characteristics, etc. So there are those for whom change and disruption is very easily accessible and they welcome it and they want it. There are others who could sort of have a bed each way. And there are those who are like, no, don't move my cheese at all, please. And it's challenging to change mental models, to allow people to adopt new skill sets, etc., to be part of a rapidly evolving future. And if I use myself as an example, when I moved into the cloud world, I essentially threw away 20 years of expertise that applied in the pre-cloud world. That 20 years didn't come easily. It wasn't always fun. Yet I had to let it go, to be able to make that change. And that gave me a deep respect when I'm asking others to change, that you have to be very sensitive to that need. I think the other challenge about the future is that we don't know what the future is. With all greatest respect to our futurists in the room, is we can guess as much as we can. But one thing I would like to share, because I think it's a useful mental model, is at Amazon, we try and focus on the things that aren't going to change just as much as the things that are going to change. So, for example, on our retail side, we know that people always want a bigger selection, they want faster delivery, and they want lower price. That's never going to change. So we can focus on that. And then that frees our mental model up for some of the other stuff that may come that we just don't expect and don't anticipate, and we can focus in that. So I think the mental model key is important. I think from a societal perspective and a geostrategic perspective, it's the skills. You don't know how to do something different if you don't know how to do something different. And the comments about quantum, I think, are really well made. We know that quantum is not going to be productized in at least 5 years. You talk to the guys at Caltech who are deep into this, they're like, we're a long way away. However, we've invested heavily in skilling up a whole new generation of software developers to be able to develop in the quantum world. Because when it happens, my goodness, it's going to happen. So we better be ready, and we need to be thinking about that more.
Thank you. So I started off the panel talking about the China threat, what we call in the United States the tech competition. It's in government. I spent 25 years in U.S. government, the Pentagon and the White House, and various components. Heather came from the Hill, from the Congress, from the Senate side, when you're in the government, you have a feeling of responsibility to protect the people you represent. And when I talk to universities or I talk to the private sector, I always say national security is my job. It's not your job. But is it? And if we're talking about an all of government and all of nation, and frankly, an all of alliance and partnership, and we can talk about AUKUS a little bit as well. If we're talking about sort of an all of alliance responsibility, what is the responsibility of your companies? How do you see your responsibilities with respect to preserving our way of life and our freedoms? I'll start again with Bikram.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. Well, I think historically, the role for innovation, particularly in deep tech, has always lied with government, even up until maybe 30 or 40 years ago. But really, over the last 2, maybe 3 decades, 4 perhaps, we have seen a shift where private companies, such as the ones represented up here, are really taking the lead in a lot of areas of innovation that traditionally would have been in the remit of government. And I think there's quite a clear recognition that given the rapid change of technology, the rapid change of the threat landscape that we face, the only way that we can effectively meet these 2 challenges is through that collaboration, not only in each of our domestic economies, but I think you talked about AUKUS. I think that provides a perfect platform of like-minded ideologies, have very strong, long-standing relationships amongst the countries. And there are complementary sets of capabilities that, if put together, can give us very strong outcomes that not only can meet the challenge, but perhaps assert a position of leadership.
Heather, do you want to?
Yes, I do. So when Linda was at the Pentagon, she was working for the former Undersecretary for ANS, Acquisition and Sustainment, and was heading up CFIUS, so the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. And we started talking about this concept of trusted capital. And so how do we know, from 2010 to 2018, as far as we know, I'm sure it's double this, if not triple, there was $22 billion of Chinese capital that rolled into just Silicon Valley proper. And a lot of that was nefariously motivated to steal IP and the like. And so we started something called the Defense Investor Network in the US in 2019 around the idea of kind of just shaming investors into doing the right thing. I hate to say it that way, but it was this idea of when we wake up every day, we think of the world through a national security lens. Like there's always that lens, right? And so as people are investing and building companies and building capabilities, how do we make sure that they also look through that lens? And it's a joke, but not a joke. That the motto is for the DIN, the defense, is we're not asking you to do good for your country. We're just asking you not to do bad for your country. It's so basic. And so make good decisions. Take that extra step. Make sure that you're not accepting large amounts of LP money from nefarious actors, right? Whether that's China, Russia, or whoever. We about a year and a half ago, we actually started the DIN Australia, and just last week we launched DIN UK. So we're looking at this kind of from an allied perspective. There have been different initiatives that have been tried to happen inside of government, and what we really found was, we, meaning investors on the outside, need to be doing this ourselves. Like we need to be taking the responsibility and making investment decisions that, again, don't do bad for our respective countries and our allied relationships. It's not that hard. And so I'll stop there. But I think that's a key piece of it, is to really, again, back to the public-private, yes, government can regulate things. They can, suggest things, make things happen. But I think for the private sector to take the onus on themselves to act appropriately, I think is important.
Jonathan, this question seemed to resonate with you. I saw you nodding your head. What are you thinking?
I've got a lot of mixed up thoughts, but let me, I joined Nuix 15 months ago. And when I joined, our purpose statement was finding truth in the digital world. And we had an offsite in Tennessee, which is a great town. And we had 50 of our leaders. And the question was, who cares? I mean, finding truth is good, but what happens if Xi Jinping finds truth or Putin finds truth in the digital world? And so we've changed our purpose statement to being a force for good by finding truth in the digital world. And it's a fascinating concept because we are a listed company, and typically capitalism and suggests that you should solve for your shareholder. And I think that there's a new form of capitalism emerging. And I'm not sure, do no evil I don't like. I mean, I don't like that as a purpose statement, and I would never have one. And I think, having a don't do bad is not a particularly exciting one for me. Not that. And so then, how do you govern being a force for good? We're a private enterprise. It's complicated, by the way. And we do work with social media, and we get called out. When we're protecting user identity in the US. With companies that we've discussed today, is that good or bad? It's a complicated decision, but I do think that there is a way to run a private enterprise and actually do good and create shareholder value at the same time, and that's what we're trying to do.
That's great. Simon, how would you see the role of private industry? I mean, AWS or any other private enterprise?
I think we've seen a significant change probably in the last 15, 20 years where we've really moved from where the government was the owner and controller of the best technology you could get because they had deep pockets and things cost a lot, to a far more democratized view of technology. And we saw this happen in the government, we saw this happen in the banks. I remember early on when smartphones came out, you couldn't get a smartphone from your bank if you were working at a bank. So people would bring their own. They said, well, you can't use the network. Great, I'll use 3G or 4G at the time. So nature finds a way, technology finds a way. I think what we're seeing here is that the pace of innovation, the pace of change is so fast that controlling it at the institutional level is just not possible anymore. And my mental model is I think citizens deserve nice things. Whatever we have should be the best. Now, they're a long way from there at the moment, but they're getting better. But I think if we look in the defensive and strategic realm, it's the same thing. We need to be activating ourselves with the best that is available, not the stuff we've got, because that's the stuff we've always had. And again, talking about changes in mental models, that's a generational thought process change for a lot of folks in power. A lot of folks who are making these decisions simply because they're operating under a previous model. Now, it used to cost $1 billion to have this amazing thing. And then someone goes, well, actually, we could do it for $400. It's like, well, it's almost unbelievable, to put it bluntly. Yet, we're all seeing with the chat GPT stuff and the pace of that is like, well, it is believable and it's happening and you're seeing it happening. So now we have to adopt it. Back to our comments earlier on of who's ready to take on disruption, change, who's just going to ignore it. That's an individual choice.
Yeah, I mean, the cost of at least defense items, you go from an aircraft carrier to a swarm of drones, right? And which is more effective nowadays? I mean, an aircraft carrier can be taken out so easily. A swarm of drones, a lot easier,
Yeah.
a lot harder to be taken.
It's still nice to have an aircraft carrier. You know?
And I mean, this is terrific. And I guess the next question is, how do we know if we're winning? And how do we maintain our edge? The good guys, the democratic forces, the liberal ideals. Like how do we keep our edge? Is it just throwing more money at it? Is it STEM education? I mean, that's sort of the mantra. How do we look? I mean, the number of patents, AI patents that are issued in China far outnumber how many in the United States. The number of PhDs in STEM topics in China far outnumber all the STEM PhDs. I mean, in the West. I mean, how do we maintain? Given the numbers, how do we maintain our edge? And I'll start with you, Simon.
I think it does come down to education, but it's not an elevated education where you need so many PhDs, etc. You need them. I think it's the democratization. Again, that putting tools in people's hands is far more important than having an elite class that dictates all information. Because what we learn over time is that it's from the most unexpected sources that inspiration comes and breakthroughs come. And in my mind, it should be a 14-year-old, 15-year-old in the Northern Territory who's getting quantum computing education so that as they grow and start to see the world around them can start to take advantage of that. I think the whole Pacific region is ripe for an upskilling to enable them to contribute to the modern world as well. I see it through a very positive lens. I don't think it's a matter of winners or losers. I think it's about uplifting our societies because thriving societies like to coexist with each other.
John?
I have a slightly contrarian view to this, which is I think a balanced education. I agree with education, but I'd actually say when I think about how do you solve wicked problems, I look at, in Stanford, there's a D school. I think about the humanities. In fact, an investment, thinking about how we solve these really complex problems. It's not with STEM. It's actually with people who have a much broader general education that think horizontally rather than vertically. So I'm very focused on, I would suggest that a much broader, more general education that includes a lot more around the humanities actually does help us solve some of these really wicked problems that exist.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that because, in fact, that's what liberal societies are about, right? So we could be robotics. We could be robotic and just following sort of laws of nature, but it's the thinking big is what we're really all about. That's what our added value is. Heather.
I'm going to go with just allied partners. I think as we're looking at great power competition and a few key nefarious folks here in our globe, I think really building partnerships like AUKUS, building partnerships like Quad. I think that the United States of America is woken up a little bit and realizing we can't do this by ourselves anymore and have identified really, really key partners like Australia, frankly, for all sorts of reasons. And I think that if we're going to beat those that are trying to beat us, that I think having really solid, trusted allied partnerships is key.
So coming to your first question around how do we know we're winning, I guess may point you to a useful tool that's from ASPI called the Critical Technology Tracker. So I think they've looked at 48 technology domains.
Did they pay you? Did you buy this?
I think it's a great piece of work, though, and it is publicly accessible. And it actually is the first of its kind that at least that I've come across, that looks at some of these areas of critical technology in some detail. So that's probably a useful thing. It's kept current and which can give you data to make your own assessment of, in particular domains, how are we tracking? The second thing is about skilling and coming up with the right sets of capabilities for all these deep tech areas, certainly some of them. And I think we frankly have a problem there. We have a capacity problem. We're just not putting out enough people from our secondary and tertiary systems to meet the demand that it's going to be a huge demand that's unfolding. And so this probably means a few things, not to say that I have all the precise answers, but is first of all is to showcase the great careers that people can have in these kinds of disciplines. So probably some work has to be done in that area to attract them in. The other thing is that what we found at work a bit with universities and schools is that the decision to move into a particular discipline often happens between years 7 and 9 back at school. So maybe this suggests that we need to have a reach back right into the secondary schooling system to expose young children to these ideas and the opportunities that exist, and hopefully lay out this grand vision that we all see of how transformative these technologies are going to be to our lives over the next 20, 30, 40 years.
That's great. If I could do sort of one more rapid fire for a question that probably demands a whole panel conversation. The hallmark of our societies is openness, right? And it's not just liberal arts, but it's also open to other cultures. It's open to just thinking different ways. And I think one of the challenges of the tech competition is sort of putting up a wall, not with Mexico, but with with between democracies and autocracies. Like during the Cold War, we had all these Soviet scientists come to our countries, but they weren't going back. They weren't sending research back. They weren't. There was really a departure from the Soviet Union. But nowadays there's much more free flow. We have, we have scientists coming to our countries from China, going back. Our scientists are working there. There's a lot of going back and forth. And I think what I personally struggle with, and I'm imagining you as well, is how do you define those parameters and to make sure that we have we keep the best here? Is it visa, new visa rules? Is it 1,000 Talents program restrictions? I mean, how do we maintain our open society and still maintain our democratic society?
Thanks. Well, complex question, I think, and many governments, I think, are grappling with exactly this. Sort of as human beings, I suppose, as we look at ourselves as a planet, our natural tendency, barring geopolitical issues, is that desire to collaborate, and generally as a planet, we would get better outcomes. But I think the reality of the geostrategic competition that we've been talking about all evening here is that perhaps is not quite possible, because what we find, exactly to the points that you raised, is that we have some fantastic education systems, deep IP, which can be transferred to individuals who then may go and work in other geographies where then those very learnings may not be working in interest or alignment with ourselves. So I think a number of countries are perhaps thinking through what kind of regulation is required to govern the level of collaboration that we can achieve. And I think the reality of the world moving forward will be that there will be limitations. There will be less free flow. And in terms of looking to create environments where you can attract and keep those people, certainly visas would be one part of it. The other is, of course, just to create attractive enough opportunities where they can see a path that's unparalleled for them to build their careers, whether that's in the research environment or commercially.
Mixing it up, Jonathan.
That was sweet.
I'm going to go back to your question, which is how do we know if we're winning? And I think that we know if we're winning, and unfortunately some of us might not have jobs, but the walls go down rather than up. I mean, isn't that the end game? And I think I'm seeing the new Cold War emerging. This isn't exciting for me, and to me, that isn't how we win. And so, unfortunately, I do think there is a existential threat. And so I might be living in a parallel universe but you ask the question, how do we know if we're winning? My view is communications start opening up, to your point. We do start, and I do think the pendulum has swung, where communication is shutting down. We're stopping, we've got export restrictions. You're asking, how do we stop stuff? I think we win when we actually don't have those export restrictions. But unfortunately, I don't have the path to that. But I do think that communications would be a good start. And even in this world that we live in, I think making sure that we do have dialogue between the good and the bad, if you want, all the democracies and the autocracies, I think keeping dialogue open to me is critical, because I worry when dialogue stops.
But are you saying lack of export restrictions across the board, or are there certain countries that you're going to exclude?
But I'm saying, if you ask me what is the best scenario where you don't need that,
Okay, but let's be realistic.
But I think we're moving. I mean, I'm saying that's where I would go. I mean, I understand that we need defense, but my view is I think we should still look for dialogue. We should still look for having those, having a scenario where we actually try that. To me, we've asked a theoretical question. It is that we don't need.
I think it's also myopic to think that you can restrict the flow of knowledge and information, because I'm old enough to remember when encryption was classified as a munition in the US. So you can't have any encryption. Well, people in Switzerland created better encryption and the world used that instead. So you don't get to choose. You can't grasp onto it. It's just going to flow. So how do you cope with that world rather than pretending the alternative is true?
I think Heather, I didn't get a time, but wrapping up, Heather, do you want to?
Just real quick. So about 3 or 4 years ago, I think the number at Stanford University was their incoming freshman computer science class was 60% Chinese nationals, and Carnegie Mellon's was 80. I think, we are looking at an age of economic warfare, of IP warfare, of academic warfare. We're looking at it's everything. And so I'm not going to draw any conclusions. I'll just leave you with that data, and you can take from that what you will.
Well, I don't think we've solved the problem of Anders' family store, which is a sentimental store, and happens all on main streets all over. But I think we did. I think we've sort of brought out some of these issues up. These are hard issues, and obviously we can't solve these in a half an hour. But I think it's worth airing them, and would look forward to discussing with all of you some of these topics afterwards at the cocktail. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Great.
Now, if only you had picked up a chair and like the two of us picked up the chairs and fought each other.
Good evening, everybody. Maybe I don't need this. I have this. Okay, I've got 15 minutes with Palmer, and we are running a bit behind schedule. So I'm going to turn my timer on and get started. Let me introduce Palmer. He's an American entrepreneur based in California. He's an innovator and inventor as well. He's widely known as the founder of Oculus VR and designer of Oculus Rift, which he designed when he was only 16, finished it when he was 19. Palmer sold Oculus to Facebook in 2014 for $2 billion. Were you a teenager then?
I was 21 by then.
21.
I was 21 by then.
His current startup is Anduril, which focuses on defense technology, focused on autonomous drones and sensors for military applications. Palmer has 7 helicopters, and he has his own submarine as well.
Yeah.
And if he was not
if you're ever at the Huntington Beach Air Show, I fly a UH-60 Blackhawk demo. It's pretty cool. So.
Okay, without much ado, welcome to Australia. What brings you to Australia, firstly?
Well, Australia is the biggest international office we have at Anduril outside of our headquarters in California. We're doing a lot of work with the Australian defense apparatus. We're building robotic submarines. You might have heard about the Go Shark program. Fundamentally, Anduril is an artificial intelligence company. We have twice as many people working on software as hardware. But we build a lot of hardware products on top of that. So air vehicles, undersea vehicles, surface vehicles, land vehicles, a lot of things that are not vehicles at all. They just sit and don't really go anywhere. We're doing counter-drone systems for the United States, for allies and partners around the world. We're in combat zones around the world. We've been involved in Ukraine since the beginning of the war, or actually years before the war, depending on the way that you interpret it. And so I'm here because it's one of our largest offices. So I'm doing a few things. One, I'm meeting with all the govies. Two, I'm meeting with all the reporters. And three, most importantly, I'm trying to recruit new people for our office here because we're about 40 people so far in Australia. We're growing really rapidly. So if you know any really good people, you got to let me know.
Are you involved in the AUKUS deal as well?
So not right now. The AUKUS deal, right now has been focused on more the manned submarine technology. But of course, these things are not going to operate in a vacuum. The tools that we're building, our envision is working with manned submarines and alongside manned submarines, extending their capabilities, the things that you can do detected and undetected. And so they don't exist in a vacuum. I'd say that definitely the AUKUS deal has been very good for us, even if we're not actually part of it, if that makes sense.
Right. And how is working with the Australian government different with US government?
Well, it's actually very amusing to me because I meet with people in Australia. They say, oh, you're working with Australian defense. Must be really tough. Must be really slow. But they forget that I'm from America. And so, I mean, our bureaucracy is unparalleled. And I'd say also, separate from some of the defense challenges, I'd say there's one of the things I've really noticed in Australia is it's not just people in the defense side of things that are receptive. It's also on the purely economic side. People are really excited about us coming and spending a lot of money. For example, the deal we're doing, it's a partnership with DSTG and the Royal Australian Navy. We're putting in $70 million of our own money into that development program. So we're not a cost plus contractor. We use our own money to develop technology. And when you say $70 million to the U.S. government, it's not even worth bending it over to pick it off the ground. But then when it's in Australia, that's actually something that's meaningful. When you say we're bringing hundreds of jobs and tens of millions of dollars, that gets attention. And so I've actually found it to be extraordinarily good. We've moved very quickly. We signed the contract last July, and I think so it's been about 8 months, and we're already 3 months ahead of schedule. So, part of that is us being great, but a lot of it is also our partners being great and moving swiftly. I don't think we've ever been able to move at a pace where the customer was not the one holding things up.
Right. So you are setting up manufacturing and R&D facilities in Australia.
That's right. So, research and development and manufacturing. We're also working with a lot of existing Australian companies. Some of them are actually ones we've worked with at Anduril in the United States for years. Some of them, for example, are power electronics companies that we've been working with across all of our different platforms for years now.
And what is the role of autonomy and AI in defense? It's a big question, but if you could kind of
Yeah, that's way too big for the remaining number of minutes that we have. But I mean, the easiest way to put this is it's a force multiplier in the traditional sense. It allows you to have small numbers of people doing things that were previously only possible with large numbers of people, or maybe not at all, no matter how many people that you had. So allowing one person to manage dozens of airframes, allowing a small group of people to really deeply understand what their counterparts are doing, not just in their own nation, but also across other countries. Autonomy is a real key part of joint all-domain operations, not just Army and navies, working together within their own nation, but working with the forces of every other nation in a coalition. And one of the reasons that's so important to be able to have kind of the information you care about teased out of all of the noise and presented to the decision makers so that people can make high-level decisions and let robots deal with the kind of low-level micromanagement of the second to second, is that is the power that the Western nations of the world have, that China does not have, that Russia does not have. Even when they kind of partner on certain things, the reality is their interests are not aligned, and so they're not going to go to bat for each other. They're not going to go fight a war on behalf of the other. And so in a sense, they're isolated. They everything they do, they have to do themselves. Whereas the United States, Australia, and all of our allies and partners around the world, we're willing to help each other out, to let each other operate our systems out of other nations, to have bases in other countries, to do joint training exercises so that when shit hits the fan, it's not our first time operating in the region. And I'd say that autonomy is going to be key to leveraging that. You want every sensor from every nation in the coalition to be a sensor for every effector from every nation in the coalition. And that only works if you're able to make these machines work together at a much faster and more intelligent rate than people making phone calls and setting points and sending emails. I'd say the pace that we saw with joint operations in, let's say, the war on terror, where there'd be, call it 1,000 consequential decisions that needed to be made every year between these kind of joint forces. What happens when you need to make 1,000 decisions in the course of one afternoon? Because that's what it's going to look like if we end up in a real conflict.
And is that what is needed for Western powers to keep up with China, which is kind of becoming more belligerent in the region?
Well, they're becoming more belligerent, and I think a lot of their aims are also becoming more obvious. And look, I was part of the problem. I made millions of virtual reality headsets in China. I used to spend time in China. If I had no national allegiances, that's where I would be getting stuff done. Because as an engineer who wants to make things, there is no better place in the world. And I say that as a total patriot, super jingo American. I think we're the best country in the world, the whole package. But as an engineer who wants to make products, I recognize they have supply chain advantages, regulatory advantages, expertise advantages. It's not about cheap labor. It's an outdated way to think about it. They are truly the best place in the world at getting these types of things done. And so we're going to have to maximize the advantages we do have. We're not the best at manufacturing for now. We are not the people who are able to crank things out at the lowest cost for now. But we are the ones with the biggest group of super friends and the widest set of different ways of doing things. And I think that we can help cover each other's weaknesses there.
Right. And you have spoken about cyber weapons, including in the op-ed you wrote today. You mentioned cyber weapons. So if you could tell us more, what are cyber weapons and why are they needed in today's time?
Well, in general, you want to be using the effect with the maximal effect for the cost. And there's a lot of really interesting cyber capabilities that exist. I think personally, I'm way more interested in offensive cyber than defensive cyber, mostly because defensive cyber is very, very well tackled by the kind of consumer and enterprise market. There are enormous numbers of people in every major technology company working on defensive cyber technology. We do not have nearly as many people who I think are working on offensive cyber warfare technology. To be clear, I'm not saying the US and other nations don't have exquisite capabilities in this area, but we don't have the quantity. We don't have the people. If you look at nations like Iran and like Russia and even like North Korea, the reason they're investing in offensive cyber warfare is because they see that as an asymmetrical advantage. It's an area where they can actually lead us and beat us. And so I'd love to see the United States get better in that. That said, I'm not building any offensive cyber warfare tools. That's just me up on my podium saying what I wish would happen.
Right. On a slightly different yet related note, do you think Russia and China are aligned in this war against Ukraine? And is that aligned?
No, it's actually super inconvenient for China. This is one of the reasons you've seen them kind of take this tortured position where they're supporting the Russians, but also they're saying that Ukraine is totally right and they actually own Crimea. And it's ridiculous. But China needs to say this because that's what backs up their claims of ownership over Taiwan. So they have to simultaneously support Russia in the actual conflict while denouncing the entire cause and reason for the conflict and the idea that they even own Ukraine in the first place, even as they help them invade them. And so when I mentioned this earlier, but this is one of the things we do have going for us. Thank goodness you don't have this axis of evil, as it were, where Russia and China and Iran and North Korea are all perfectly aligned. They actually all have big problems with each other, and they're going after a lot of the exact same things. Russia and China are both looking at places like, for example, the northern Japanese island chains with exactly the same belief of that should be ours. And that's going to be a really big point of tension for them, and one reason that they're never going to ever be able to really truly get along. So we have that going for us. That's nice. But there's a world where these things diverge, and I think you see superpowers emerge pretty quickly in the modern era. And I worry about a world where you see maybe not new superpowers, but you worry about new powers becoming far more relevant because they have a breakthrough. Who was it that talked about? We want someone in Australia, who's young and coming up with breakthroughs in quantum computing and quantum technology. Well, what happens when that person is in a country that recognizes their breakthrough and very quickly weaponizes it and decides to use it to win a fight with their neighbors that they've been trying to win for hundreds of years or thousands of years? There's a lot of people in the Middle East who I think are in this mold where it wouldn't be a great thing for them to have these breakthroughs. I think there's a lot of countries in Africa that people are underestimating that are also ripe for these types of things to happen. And they're not going to have the bureaucracy we have in the US. They're not going to have the bureaucracy that you even have in Australia. So if they have a breakthrough, I could imagine them actually being willing to capitalize on it much faster and put it into action much faster. So I suspect the top threat that we see in the AI space in weapons is not going to be any of the top powers that we see today. I think it's going to be somebody that you don't even necessarily expect.
Oh, do you want to name? And shame?
I explicitly do not, because I've been told by people in the State Department that it's super unhelpful when I do things like that.
Right. I can't not ask you tech-related questions. So on technology side of things, we've seen the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank. What is your view on that? And do you feel that the sector is susceptible now in the current cycle?
I don't think this is the right audience for my true opinions. I mean, if you really want to get into it, the entire banking system is largely farcical, and the entire thing could collapse at any moment. Everyone, if they had to, if everyone had, no, not everyone, if anyone had to recognize their unrealized losses the way that Silicon Valley Bank did, they would probably collapse. And so I'd say the difference that you had there was not in the fundamentals. The difference was in the willingness of their customers to make a run. And it's also because Silicon Valley is a very insular world. There's only a few people who really call the shots. And I will tell you, probably half the money that moved in those first 2 days probably was the result of maybe 3 people making phone calls and text messages, like directly attributable. And so that's not the case in many other areas. But then that makes you realize, okay, so it's not as centralized. But how many people would it really take? And this is a thought experiment I've run so many times. And these are names, I'm just throwing them out there as examples. So in Silicon Valley, they're relatively unknown names outside of the world in finance. But what would it take? How many people would it take to cause the same thing to happen on a global scale in the rest of the banking industry? Well, like what if Bill Gates came out and said, "Hi, I'm Bill Gates, and I'm telling all Americans that you need to be terrified and you need to get your money out of the banking system because it's going to collapse." Okay, well, that's just one guy. Well, what if you join him with a few people who are ideologically kind of opposed? You've got an Elon Musk in there. Maybe you've got a Richard Branson for that global angle. How many people does it really take? And you start to realize, oh shoot, it's only like 3 or 4 people could actually cause the exact same thing to happen. So that was the biggest thing I learned about Silicon Valley Bank is it was a little thing that happened in an insular world, but we've seen because of the way the financial dynamics have worked out, I think of many or most banks are in a place where if they had to cover, if they basically had to sell to cover their unrealized losses at a point where the market's gone down and where the investments they made prior didn't make sense, where they bought into mortgages that were at rates that are now very favorable. You get paid to own a home now. It's great. You're on a long-term mortgage. Anyway, the whole thing could collapse at any moment, in my opinion. So that's my opinion. There was a reason I was a big Bitcoin guy early on. So don't take financial advice from me. But I'm one of those nutters that thinks that the gold standard maybe wasn't so bad. So just ignore me. Let me just say crazy stuff, and me and Alex Jones are going to be like 50% overlap on it. So.
I'd squeeze one last question before people can go home. So Bloomberg published a story last week about Sony projecting to sell fewer than 300,000 PlayStation VR2 headsets, which is much less than the 2 million that they had initially projected. Do you think, and that was kind of their ambition to play a leading role in development of metaverse.
Yep.
Do you think metaverse is dead?
It is not. Oh, so it's definitely not dead. And to be clear, I have no bias towards, let's say, Facebook or Meta. Yeah, they fired me, and that's why I started Anduril. So and I'm still enraged about it. And they're wasting a ton of money, making a lot of bad decisions. But I also believe in the concept of a metaverse. This idea of a digital parallel world that exists alongside our own, where we're living and working and playing. For 10 years, my signature on my emails was "See you in the metaverse." So I'm all in. I'm a total virtual reality nutter, and I'm still a big believer in it. I will say the thing about the predictions, that's coming from so-called analysts. The analysts are all a total joke in the VR space. They don't understand it at all. They said nonsense all the time when I was at Oculus and all the time afterwards. I mean, I remember one specific one where they estimated the cost of our headset, just like completely nonsense. Super data is the worst. I'm normally not willing to name names, but super data has caused me so much pain over my career by just posting crazy stuff. There was a point where they said that the original PlayStation VR was going to sell less than 1 million units. You know how many units it ended up selling? Over 12 million units. They have no idea what they're talking about. There was another time where Super Data published, they said that Sony had only sold 5 million PlayStation VRs. And guess what? Sony had already announced in their quarterlies the previous quarter that they had shipped over 7 million. What the heck? So people are writing all these stories. Oh my gosh, Super Data says PlayStation has only sold 5 million units. That's not as many. And they had already broken 7 a quarter. It was publicly available information. So I will say analysts in their analysis, look, Bloomberg, of course, it's on another level. Here's what I think. I don't think they're going to sell 200,000 units. I don't think they're going to sell 300,000. I think that PlayStation VR 2 is going to hugely outsell the initial one. Adjusted for inflation, it's cheaper than the original. It's much higher resolution. It's much more comfortable. There's many more games, much better IP. The PlayStation 5 has dominated this console generation, whereas the last time around, the PlayStation 4 was not nearly so dominant. So they're actually in a better place overall. And you have to remember, Oculus, or I guess Meta, owned by Meta now, they sold over 20 million Oculus Quest 2s. Over 20 million, which shows there's an enormous amount of consumer interest in VR. And so when people say, oh, is Metaverse dead? Is VR dead? I would say, no, there's literally tens of millions of people who are using VR regularly. Some of them have good reasons. Some of them are just wasting time. But the number of good reasons are going to expand continuously, and the number of reasons to waste your time are going to expand continuously. And then, because I'm the one talking, I can do whatever I want. I want to answer the last question on the last panel. What do we do? What do we do about all these other countries doing stuff back and forth? And I want to present my recommendation. One, I think it's a cultural shift. I think we need to make it anathema to enable these things. I really love the idea of going to people and saying, at least don't do bad things for your country. I think it is just as reasonable for it to be culturally toxic for someone to be a professor who goes overseas and talks about sensitive technologies in a way that is clearly harmful to his host nation. Like during the Cold War, there were controls in place over what you could export and what you could say, but there were also cultural controls. And I think that those are actually more powerful. You can't stop the spread of information. You can't stop encryption. But you know what you could do? You can make it where if it's actually a military technology, that same person in Switzerland, Sweden, Germany, Australia is going to say, I can't do that. That's wrong because that's helping the bad guys. And then the second bit is we need to bring back the word defector. We need to have defector visas. People who have critical technologies in China and in Russia, we need to be hauling them out of their countries, draining. I mean, people call it brain drain. We need to be doing this consciously. We need to say our goal is to steal all of the best people. And you might say, Palmer, that'll never work. People of certain political persuasions don't like immigration. They don't like immigration when it's presented in a certain way. But if you instead say this is not about compassion, this is about we're going to steal the best people, we're going to kick them in the balls, and we're going to beat them over the head with them, then all of a sudden people are all about it. There's nobody who's against that. And so I think we need to go take all of those top Chinese scientists. We need to take all of the best Russian scientists the same way that we used to in the Cold War and post-World War II. And when you say we're going to bring them to America, we're going to give them an American wife, an American life, and we're going to do way better. Anyway, that's my bit. It's something that we could be doing. We used to talk about defectors, and I want to bring that word because our governments don't talk about it. It's not polite to talk about it. There's this idea that being a defector is a bad thing not to be talked about. I think we need to make it clear if you're willing to more or less betray your country to help countries that have ideals that are aligned around universal human rights, the right to self-determine, the right to self-govern, the right to have your own religion. We should reward those people and recognize that they are going to need to be compensated for that enormous risk that they're taking. So that's my bet.
It was fascinating talking to you. It's a shame we only have 15 minutes. I'd call Nitin to close the event for us. I hope you all had an insightful evening with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Palmer.
So I'm just going to take a minute. I'm still recovering from all the conversation. So I think I can actually speak on behalf, I just take the liberty to speak on behalf of everybody in this room, that all of us have got the opportunity to attend a lot of different events and forums. And I think the conversation we heard today from all the speakers has been one of the best I have ever come across. Great insight for us. And also the fact that it left me speechless. The only word which comes to my mind is thank you. So on behalf of Bloomberg, I want to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers for sharing the great insight, the audience for staying back late to attend, ASW for being one of the partners, and Bloomberg team. Last but not least, the Australian Strategy Policy Institute. Justin, under your leadership, your team has done a fantastic job to put together a great set of speakers, conversation, and content. And we hope that Sydney Dialogue will go from strength to strength, and we'll be happy to support in every possible way. So best wishes for that. So what I feel today, the conversation we heard, the ideas we had is just the start of the process. And as we move forward, the conversation will continue in the longer run. In the short run, we can continue the conversation over network outside as we enjoy the beautiful harbor view. So without taking much time, thank you for coming and enjoy the network. Thank you.